Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of Platform Enterprise, the show that platforms the projects and visions of people around the world working hard to make their impact a positive one. In addition to the podcast, I also release a weekly newsletter investigating the themes explored on that week's podcast. You can find these investigations on stories.platformenterprise.com, and you can also sign up to receive them every week in your inbox. Sign up today to read my investigation into a Hollywood A-lister who is yet to return any of the money associated with 1MDB. What is 1MDB? Well, you've come to the right place. On the show this week is phenomenal journalist Clare Rewcastle Brown. Clare single-handedly exposed the largest corruption scandal the world has ever seen, which resulted in $4.5 billion being stolen from the Malaysian people to line the pockets of the Prime Minister and his associates. Through her work, Clare exposed a global network of elites, including Hollywood actors, politicians, and world banks, amassing huge amounts of illegal wealth to fund parties, lifestyles, and even a couple of Hollywood movies. Clare is the freelance journalist who connected all the dots and put her life on the line to do so. This conversation details her case study of the criminally super rich and the vital role media has to play in holding the elite accountable. Clare has written 2 books on the subject, The Sarawak Report and The Wolfcatcher, both of which are linked in the show notes. I urge you to read them to support her continued investigation and to learn more about the offshore structures and libel laws that incentivize corruption and keep the elite in power. So Clare, thank you so much for joining me today. This seems like a very, very sort of special episode of Platform Enterprise to have such a distinguished journalist on the show. Oh, you can make that face, but you're definitely distinguished.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for inviting me to join your interesting series of talks.
Thank you. So, you have been sort of called the person that uncovered the world's largest heist. And yeah, I imagine that there might be some people listening to this that don't know what it is actually. So could you explain a little bit about the world's largest heist and what you've done over the past few years?
Yes, well, I think it's interesting that one of the reasons that so few people outside of the financial world know about the 1MDB scandal is because of the power of the people who were involved. And by power, I mean the power to intimidate the media into refraining from covering the story. It took about 5 years in all, bit by bit, as piece by piece the information came out, and then you made some big progress with the Department of Justice in the United States unveiling their prosecutions. And during that time, I could not, by and large, get the wider media and certainly the British media, which is so trammeled by rigorous libel laws that really allow the powerful and the wealthy to operate with impunity as far as being held to account by the media is concerned, wanting to cover this story at all. So I was there, putting my neck out and really being targeted by a pushback operation to discredit my reporting on this. And as a result, it's a great flamboyant story and people weren't hearing about it. They weren't hearing about the billions being splashed by Hollywood top actors that have been stolen from one of the developing countries in the Far East. It's getting out now, bit by bit.
It's all everything you just said is quite shocking and insidious and dangerous, and yet that final sentence about the elite in Hollywood essentially spending billions of stolen money from developing countries in the world, it seems almost like the plot of a cartoon about the wealthy or the elite of today. And it seems that so many people are aware that this kind of stuff might be happening or probably is happening, and yet it's not being uncovered. And yet here you are, you've uncovered it, and nobody's willing to talk about it.
Well, yes. I mean, you've got the world's most powerful bank that is still pushing back on this, Goldman Sachs. It does now, as of last month have a deferred prosecution agreement hanging over it, i.e., that's an admission for the first time by Goldman Sachs that it acted in a criminal manner, and that the Department of Justice could still, unless they're very, very good boys, and of course they've paid up several $billion worth of fines, but they could still be prosecuted for those crimes. So that's progress. But I think really, to me, if I'm going to talk about 1MDB and the whole investigation, it opened my eyes, or at least confirmed and illustrated what is going on in our world. And for me, it was a real educational journey. A lot of us can be suspicious, that certain people are taking mega advantage in a criminal manner of, the vulnerable and cornering our resources on this planet. And really, this was my case study. To show exactly what's going on and how our financial and global systems have been gently structured over the years to make it possible for the wealthy and the powerful to bypass the rule of law and to treat the planet as if it was their playground. And of course, I'm talking about the offshore system, banking secrecy, money laundering havens, within Europe, such as Luxembourg and Switzerland, and of course the Treasure Islands, and the failure of regulators to act in most cases. And of course, if you've got the media being subtly muzzled by libel laws, which is the case, and increasing privacy laws, and intellectual property laws and all the rest, then really, we've nailed it down. If you're talking, from the perspective of the people who are benefiting from this, the large companies and the criminally super rich. So 1MDB was my way of illustrating what was happening, and it took me about 5 years to do it. And I started at the grassroots, at the ground level of what corruption does. I grew up in one of the most beautiful and richly resourced corners of the world, in the jungle of Borneo, which is an island in the tropics, which has the greatest biodiversity on the planet. Because I grew up there, I had a strong, passionate love for this place. I knew how valuable its wildlife and its fauna and flora were to all of us on the planet. And of course, so I had an environmental sensitivity. I was a journalist, so I followed these things. And I was aware that there was this underreported scandal, which was the total destruction of Borneo and other similar places on the planet for mass agriculture. People do now know about the oil palm crisis that is driving a lot of this deforestation. Certainly in Borneo it was. And I decided as a journalist, I'd given up my mainstream work, that I would do my little bit in my little corner of the world to try and explain why this was happening. It was completely unnecessary. It was utter poor governance. The native people of Borneo is a small population of indigenous people, were getting nothing from this destruction. They were being thrown out of their homes, their livelihoods. They could no longer live off the jungle and off the rivers, which had once, fed them sustainably for hundreds of years. And the reason for it was a cartel of political decision makers and their business cronies who were making all the money, avoiding paying tax by and large, and siphoning that money out into the advanced economies where they wanted to spend it and invest it and make themselves even more rich as billionaires. And they were able to do that secretively, using the offshore system, using our banks, using an army of Western professionals who were quietly showing them the way, facilitating all of this. So I set about using the newly invented internet from about 2008, both digging into this situation, this blatant corruption, this blatant abuse of human rights, and also reaching back. I realized that it was vital. There's no point just covering something in a distant world. This was, the people of the country didn't know what was happening. They were being kept in the dark about what was going on and why their lives were so terrible. There was a very, very oppressive government. There was a, totally managed media. And I decided, I'll just have a little platform, and anyone who's interested can just go on and see what I'm reporting on. And so I started a blog called the Sarawak Report, and it was directed at the people of Sarawak and Malaysia. It was for their consumption to open their eyes to the things that their local reporters and journalists knew about but couldn't report on because they get clapped in jail, basically. But I could do this thanks to the internet from the other side of the world. And I was amazed. I had and delighted. I had an immediate response, and immediately people in Malaysia were very interested in what I had to say. That was clearly confirming a lot of local suspicions. So I reported on corruption for about 2 or 3 years at a state level. And I'm talking about multi-billion dollar corruption by state leaders, by political potentates who'd been in power for decades. Until eventually, frustrated by the lack of action from the authorities, really, who should have by then have been tapping on the doors of some of these gentlemen who'd been stealing from their people. I started to look at, corruption at the very highest level, namely the Prime Minister of the Malaysian government. There was a very suspicious slush fund that he had started up soon after he got into power, and it was much gossiped about. This was 1MDB, One Malaysia Development Bahad, which means fund, really, or company. People were, behind the scenes were talking about this. It was an obvious corruption exercise, but it was very hard to prove it. It was supposed to be a development fund whereby the Malaysian government was borrowing billions on the international markets, supposedly in some kind of some kind of quasi-sovereign wealth fund, in order to invest it to make more money. Of course, that's not how sovereign wealth funds are actually structured or justified. A sovereign wealth fund is usually, something that a country's resources, wealth might be put into. If you're producing oil, you've got an excess of wealth, you put it into a wealth fund to invest for the benefit of the nation. But this wasn't excess cash that Malaysia had. It was expensively borrowed cash on the international markets. The Prime Minister of the country, who was also the Finance Minister, was touting that he would somehow be able to make a great profit on it for the country. Compared to, say, ordinary business being able to make a profit. The people whose taxes he was using to borrow that money would normally be considered better at making entrepreneurial decisions than a government. So everyone could see that this was a bogus venture. And of course, it's soon after I started to get interested about a year after it had been launched, when it became clear that they weren't being accountable. This fund was delaying on providing its accounts, and it was changing its auditors all the time. It went through 3 lots of top accountancy firms, and there were clearly, quarrels going on about laying out the company's accounts. And of course, the reason was that about half of the billions that had been raised. I'm being modest. Nearly all of the billions that were being raised were being stolen by the associates, Prime Minister, by the Prime Minister's proxies. In particular, a young Chinese boy, Malaysian boy called Jolo, who was in his mid-20s, who was acting as the Prime Minister's proxy in organising for these extraordinary thefts to take place. So I started reporting on various anomalies to do with 1MDB, as others were, but I was somewhat more trenchant. Until mid-2013, I was passed a very interesting document from within the bond trading community, which illustrated, well, it was basically the offering launched by Goldman Sachs for one of three massive borrowings that this fund was doing. They issued a total of $6.5 billion worth of bonds at a very high interest rate for a government borrowing, with a government-linked company, and through three separate tranches that were all underwritten by Goldman Sachs. And that was between 2012 and 2013. And what was particularly suspicious about them was that they weren't being advertised on the open bond market. The whole thing was being secretly conducted by Goldman Sachs with its private customers, and no one had actually seen the terms and conditions of the bonds. And so when I got this document, I looked through it with a relative of mine, actually, who was an expert on bonds. And he just went through it and said, this is ridiculous. That the commission that Goldman Sachs is taking, which is written in this offering, is like 100 times what any bank would expect to take. That's a suspicious red flag. And then the interest rate is ridiculous, ludicrous, and unnecessary. What's going on here? And then there was another very strange aspect to it, which was that the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, IPIC, was acting as some kind of guarantor for a Malaysian government-backed bond. It was all very, very odd. And very little writing had been done about it. There'd been one or two careful articles in the financial press about Goldman Sachs' big, bonanza with these bonds in the Far East. But again, everyone is so cautious around the rich and powerful when it comes to reporting. So I thought, well, to hell with that. And I wrote an article suggesting that the US authorities should investigate their most powerful bank because this stank like a rotten fish. My contact emailed me immediately after and said, you've got 48 hours. If Goldman Sachs haven't sued you, then you're right. They didn't sue me. And I thought, right, okay, I'm going to go after this. And I have been going after Goldman Sachs ever since. And I think I've been thoroughly proven right, obviously, by the latest deferred prosecution against that bank. Meanwhile, the other bits and pieces of information started to come in where I could get a chink on the story, Malaysia side, about 1MDB and about those thefts. It started me off on an adventure of reporting and discovery. And as I say, it illustrated to me how the financial system enables powerful rulers within their own countries, kleptocrats, to steal with impunity and hide the money in our countries.
It's an unbelievable almost story. One that seems almost stranger than fiction.
Well, it felt like it. It felt like being in some kind of, living in a movie. As many of the people that, that I lived through this with, it was people in most enormous characters, and all of them seemed straight out of central casting, and many of my companions in this adventure used to say, my goodness, this is like living in a movie, when's it going to end? In the end, over 5 billion was stolen in cash. I mean, and that's left a bill, of course, of well over double that, because, the money has to be repaid with interest. And then, more billions were stolen in order to try and cover up the hole. So in total, we're approaching 8 billion stolen from the Malaysian people that now has to be paid back with interest. And you have a spiraling debt that's been left on this vulnerable nation. And so many people got caught up in the way. You had these enormous characters. Joe Low himself was an astonishing young man, and the chutzpah of a 26-year-old boy that dazzles a prime minister into believing that he can hide all this money and squirrel it out of the country for him and come up with this complex offshore structure for robbing 1MDB. And then, of course, being that he was in his 20s, being that he was in charge of billions that had been stolen, he couldn't resist but sort of kind of going on the world's biggest party. And that's how I caught them. It was because Joe Low couldn't really, just keep his head down. And from within a week of the first heist of $700 million, he stole straight into his own bank account. Within a week of that, Joe Low was over in Las Vegas with his entourage of buddies, wowing even Las Vegas by the extraordinary spending and ostentation of their partying. He then moved on lock, stock and barrel to one of the poshest flats in New York and started spending literally millions in New York nightclubs, buying Cristal champagne for, Hollywood starlets. And it started to get reported in the media in America. Who was this Malaysian man of mystery? And that started bouncing back into the Malaysian press. It caught my eye. And so people started wondering, everyone knew this guy was an advisor on 1MDB, and then suddenly he pops up partying in a way that the Western press is beginning to follow. But when I knew I'd, join the dots was a couple of years later with the release of one of Hollywood's most famous films, The Wolf of Wall Street, which happened in early 2014. And it was over Christmas in the run-up to that I received an email from my Malaysian contacts to say that the extremely flamboyant, powerful and hugely disliked wife of the Prime Minister had been pushing education officials in Malaysia to show, obviously at cost to the public, this new upcoming movie to school children in the country.
You're joking.
And the reason was that this would advise them on a life that they shouldn't lead. Malaysia is a very conservative Muslim country, and anyone who's seen Wolf of Wall Street, I don't think you'd show it to anybody's children, let alone to strict Muslim children. In fact, when it actually came down to it, the Muslim clerical board that that censors films banned Wolf of Wall Street from the whole of Malaysia, let alone the classroom. But, one couldn't wonder, but why? And someone had done a bit of research and had identified that Rosma's son, who was the stepson of the Prime Minister, was the producer of the movie and had somehow managed to get the 100 million that had been invested in that Leonardo DiCaprio extravaganza, which of course was all about a huge theft and the spending of the money in the most raucous and inappropriate way. So
the Wolf of Wall Street was funded indirectly by 1MDB.
Well, Rachel. So I start looking into this. I start Googling, and this was actually the last Christmas with my mum. We were there. She wasn't so well, I found myself in the middle of the Christmas sort of melange, just burrowing online, into my computer and not really helping as I should. As I started to put the dots together, yeah. Because when I started looking into the launch of the movie, suddenly there was this Joe Low character, the advisor on
Ah.
1MDB, the big spender. He was there in every single launch picture, standing next to Reza Aziz, the producer son of the Prime Minister, and Leo DiCaprio, Martin Scorsese, Margot Robbie. What's fat little Joe Low doing in there? Well, I wrote an article and I questioned in that article what you've just questioned. Could Jolo's presence be an indication that some of those billions that appeared to be missing from the accounts of 1MDB could have found their way into the 100 million budget behind Wolf of Wall Street? I, of course, was immediately attacked by a series of legal threats. But, to cut a very long story short, yes, I'd hit the nail on the head. That's exactly where the money had come from.
Oh
And
my
the FBI was
God.
later to prove in searing detail once it got to work on the story and started tracing exactly where the money had gone from 1MDB into the bank account of Reza Aziz's Red Granite Productions in order to pay for Wolf of Wall Street and several other films. There was much more than 100 million that was taken. And that was just one of the many expenditures. There were jets. There was one of the world's super yachts that cost $250 million. There was massive partying to entertain Leo DiCaprio. Picasso's bought by Joe Low to give to Leo DiCaprio. Sets of diamonds and a crystal piano that were bought by Joe Low out of the stolen money to give to Miranda Kerr, who was one of the many glamorous Hollywood, females who seemed to fall for this pudgy young Chinese Malaysian from Penang.
Oh my God.
Can't think what she saw in him, but anyway, she swapped him for the Snapchat billionaire who she eventually married, didn't she? But he had a string of these sorts of ladies receiving lovely gifts, and none more so, of course, than Rosma Mansour, the Prime Minister's wife herself, who Joe Low the other day. A recording has just been released, and Joe Low has acknowledged in that at least $500 million was spent on diamond jewelry for Rosma Mansour out of the stolen 1MDB money. Of course, another $1 billion of the stolen money went into her husband, the Prime Minister's bank account in KL as well, in order to buy elections, fund their lifestyle, and cover whatever other political, purposes he needed it for. All of this came out in the end after my reporting and then series of leaks that I managed to obtain provoked at last an investigator by regulators who I would say ought to have spotted that there was a problem long before, but actually it took the media, it only took me, to be honest, to reveal, the concerns about this whole affair before regulators who ought to have picked up on the money flows earlier got to grips, but they did.
I just want to pause for a second because a couple of thoughts that have sprung to mind. I mean, the first is that this is a fantastic example of why trickle-down economics just doesn't work, because money was taken from essentially indigenous people and then used in the elite and luxury echelons of society to generate more wealth for people that clearly didn't need it, and to spend wealth on people that didn't need it. I mean, I don't think Miranda Kerr needs anybody buying her a crystal piano.
I think trickle-down economics is, you have to come up with some excuse for stealing everybody's money.
Of course. And then the other thing that I'm thinking of, and this might be way off base, but in a time of the Me Too era, i.e., when people are being called out for abuses of power, for unfair treatment of people, why have these Hollywood stars and financial elite not been hung up to dry? I mean, why is the Wolf of Wall Street not, on one of those lists of, we don't platform this, we don't talk about this, we don't,
Well,
we don't encourage this.
Rachel, I'll give you an exclusive. Leo DiCaprio appears to be the king of Hollywood, and he doesn't want this story bandied around. And it seems to me that everybody is kowtowing to Leo's sensitivities on this matter. He would rather be promoted as the actor environmentalist who is seeking to save the planet than as someone who actually benefited from a bonanza of theft, indirectly resulting from the corruption that was destroying the Borneo jungle. And it seems that right now, most people in Hollywood would rather keep their careers and not upset Leo, but I'm a bit loud-mouthed, so I'm saying it.
This is interesting because I have heard, and I'm not sure how, it might be just from coming from a family of journalists, I have heard in the past that the environmentalism that has been attached to Leo DiCaprio's career over recent years was in fact a PR front after his nth attempt to fail winning an Oscar, that actually he needed to curtail the party boy image.
But it's a bit like being royalty, isn't it, winning an Oscar these days? And royals are expected to do good. So, if you want to be, an Oscar winner, you've got to have all sorts of good causes that you do beyond, appearing in movies that may or may not be great. And so we've seen this. We've seen Hollywood aspiring actors adopting various, worthy causes. But one does sometimes wonder if their hearts are entirely in it.
Mm-hmm. So, because of certain people's positions in societies all around the world, but exclusively elite and powerful ones, the public aren't being given the information required to make educated choices about who they do or do not support. People are being allowed to walk free without prosecution. I mean, Goldman Sachs is up for deferred prosecution. But I mean, I actually read this morning, and I might have my information wrong, but the prime minister that embezzled all of this money, that stole from his people, was booted out, but is now back in coalition. Is that correct?
Yes, he's been found guilty, but of course he's appealing, and appeals will, deliberately take years. And while he appeals, he's allowed to continue sitting in Parliament, and his party, has made no moves to sort of boot him out or blackball him, or and the general view is that he'll keep appealing until the king pardons him or something. And yes, there's been an effective political coup in Malaysia. So after the 1MDB scandal was exposed, and this is the power of the media, this is the role of the media in a democracy. Once people realized what had happened, they found the determination and anger to unite, to throw out, for the very first time, the coalition that had a grip on Malaysia and had not been, released its grip on power since independence. For 60 years, that government, for the first time, was voted out in 2018, largely because of the fury of the population on discovering the kleptocracy surrounding 1MDB. So a year and a half later, the same powerful forces, the same powerful political parties that had been booted out, managed to gain enough defections from, the elected parliamentarians in order to stage a backdoor coup. In fact, their majority is highly suspect. But there's been Parliament has been largely closed down ever since the coup, under the guise of COVID. and the country's being run now effectively by, a political coup, which has elbowed Parliament out of the picture. So that's the situation you have. And the former convicted Prime Minister is part of that coalition behind the backdoor coup.
It's astonishing. It's astonishing that all of this information can come out and all of this be revealed. But actually, the fact that someone can embezzle billions of dollars from his own people and yet somehow retain power just goes to show how powerful the powerful are and how much systematic change needs to be done. Like, it's not just a couple of bad apples, but we have created systems that allow for and engender such abuses of power day in, day out.
One of the things that again, for me, it's been an education. And one of the speeches that struck me most was that of Andy McCabe, who subsequently became the head of the FBI before Donald Trump sacked him, but at that time was the deputy head when the joint announcement between the Department of Justice and the FBI was made, saying that they had seized nearly $2 billion worth of assets linked to 1MDB in Malaysia, and basically issuing the civil prosecution against Joe Low and indirectly Najib for stealing that money. And in it, he explained why America and the advanced economies need to take this seriously. Corruption that appears to be happening in a distant place across the other side of the world, it threatens us just as it threatens the vulnerable people who are being stolen from. Because that powerful criminal money is entering our systems and is polluting our systems. It's corrupting our people. It's corrupting our politics. And we need to get these criminal actors, these wealthy criminal actors, out of our countries. So it's a global problem. And that's illustrated. I mean, part of this huge web of corruption that I've been unveiling through 1MDB, like a blood, it just shows, it's like a barium meal going through the bloodstream of the global financial system. You see exactly how corruption travels. Several really powerful and important actors in the American political system were being bought up by the money. Most recently, Elliot Broidy, the former chairman of the Republican Committee and a close ally of Donald Trump, has pleaded guilty to a story that I was amongst the first to expose. He received $8 million from Joe Low, plus a promise of $79 million more if there was a success in closing down the 1MDB scandal investigation in America.
God.
So Joe Low hired this powerful Republican, the chairman of the National Committee, to lobby to get the Department of Justice to close down the 1MDB investigation against Najib and Joe Low. And all that came out. I mean, I got a leak and I exposed that he was linked to Joe Low back in 2018. Now we have the full story of what happened, and there were others. There were others in the Obama administration who were also bribed earlier through 1MDB money in order to try and stop the 1MDB investigations and to influence American policymaking. So this is why this is a global threat. We live in a global world, and corruption affects us all. And we're all endangered by it in the same way that we're all endangered by the consequences of stripping out the Borneo jungle in terms of climate change.
Do you think that wealth at a certain level erodes integrity? Because this seems to be a culture-free epidemic of corruption. happening in the East, the West, across borders?
I think greed is one of our most dangerous and addictive sins, weaknesses, and it's insidious. And I think that if a certain set of people consider that they have impunity and that they can get away with anything and that they're above the law, then greed takes hold of them. And there is never enough once you've started stealing like this, and you get trapped by it. Somebody who abuses their public office to commit a crime of theft is then trapped because they need that public office to protect them from the consequences of their actions. And so therefore they're led to authoritarian and oppressive forms of government. And bingo, there you are. You've got a dictator.
Right. Okay. I wonder then, in a time where we're questioning a lot the role of capitalism, what that has to play in the degradation of the environment, in the abuses of human rights all around the world, and considering your, as you say, case study in abuses of power and immense theft, in your opinion, do you think it's possible to have a democratic capitalist society?
Yeah, we just need rules. I mean, I think since the 1980s, there has been a deliberate pushback by interested parties influencing politicians to make it easier for them to avoid abiding by the rules and regulations that we need to ensure that individuals don't gain too much of the pie, they don't gain an unfair advantage, don't get themselves in a monopolistic position where they can control outrageous tranches of the public resources and wealth. That rules are put in place to try and prevent one person taking all within a capital system. But if you get rid of the rules, if you adopt a mantra that we don't need government's a bad thing, rules are a bad thing, let the magic of the markets solve all, basically dog eat dog, then what you're actually doing is allowing a few people in strategic positions to grab everything. So I think capitalism works as long as there are fair rules that everyone has to abide to equally. I mean, you and I live in fear of, maybe underpaying our taxes by a couple of £100. The most rich and wealthy corporations, as people are increasingly now aware, have managed to rig the system, game the system, so that they pay no tax whatsoever. And that's all been done in the name of deregulation. Good thing. It's not. We have to regulate ourselves. We have to have laws, and everyone should equally abide by them.
And how can the media help? I think what you've done is such an amazing example.
Yeah, you can't fix what you don't know. People can't demand or vote for something if they haven't been informed about the problems. The media play a vital role in any kind of democracy. They should be holding to account, shedding light, helping explain, simplify to the person who only has maybe 10 minutes at the start of a day of a busy working life. We all need to attend to our democracy. It's it's a job. It's one of our chores, to vote wisely and to keep ourselves sufficiently informed. And obviously, if you've got a busy job, doing something else, tilling a field or whatever, you can't necessarily be fully on top of every detail of what is going on. It's the job of a media to responsibly present facts, to people so that they know what's going on in their world. And part of this insidious corrosion of our democracy, that is how I would see it over the last few decades, has been to prevent the media from doing that job, has been to dumb it down, to divert it, distract it, away from things that we need to be attending to, all of us, and understanding. The media has been shut up and silenced, and it needs to get back to work. The thing that these powerful thieves fear most is exposure. That's what they cannot afford. And that's why it's so important to silence the media. That's why the first thing an oppressive regime does is intimidate, control, and shut down any independent media.
Were you ever frightened while you were investigating this? Was there ever any time you were threatened?
Yes, I have been threatened, and yes, I look over my shoulder a lot. Certainly at the height of this, I used to think, because I'd go for a walk in the countryside and think, that'd be a good place for a sniper. I do this walk rather too often, You do, and of course, journalists. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm mainly in safe parts of the world. We all know how journalists are killed in great numbers all over the world, far braver people than me. And that I keep in my mind, there are far braver journalists trying to confront corruption all over the world who have lost their lives in the doing of it. And I think the reason why they do it in the same way as someone goes and fights for their country in a war is that they think it's important, and they're right. They think it's make or break for everything they believe in, and for their society, for the future of our planet and our future generations, that the truth be reported. So that, I think, takes you through these slightly challenging assignments, and along with a fair dose of anger, actually, at what one sees going on.
So what can we do as a general public to support the media, such as yourself, to keep investigating and to uncover the truth?
Well, I think support campaigns to free up the media. I mean, I'm involved in quite a lot of campaigning now, having had a number of vexatious legal suits against me that have that caused me a lot of grief in the UK. I now campaign to improve our libel laws and to help journalists do their jobs safely without having the roof taken from over their heads for writing the truth, and then having to defend themselves against slap suits. Which is the wealthy and powerful criminal regards channeling a certain percentage of their stolen money into law firms, to reputation law firms, to protect themselves from scrutiny. They regard that as a business expense, and so it is. So we need to campaign to free journalists to do their jobs without that kind of pressure and deterrence in our own country, in Britain, and related jurisdictions, of which there are many who share our oppressive libel laws. That's one thing the public can do, and just to become aware of these stories and to vote accordingly.
Yeah, sometimes we perhaps take for granted that which we have. In fact, not sometimes. It's kind of one of the conditions of being human, is forgetting how lucky we are. And perhaps for you, having grown up in Malaysia and coming to the UK years later, perhaps that's given you a sense of balance or perspective that has allowed you to keep up this fight for so long, because you really know what you're fighting for.
I think there's a terrifying complacency that I think we're beginning to realize. I think maybe the frightening events of the past few years in America, that was supposed to be the bastion of a free democratic society, has helped bring this home to a number of people, at least. We have a frightening complacency, as if our democracies had always existed and were going to continue effortlessly, by some kind of, right. there are so many interested parties who would love to see the end of our democracies, and we need to be guardians of our freedoms and our liberties and the rule of law, and every single member of a democracy has a responsibility to be vigilant and to use our brains to think, to inform ourselves, and to vote wisely. Otherwise, we will lose by default these valued institutions. We could slip back into oppressive government very easily. That's what frightens me. We're too complacent. We think that won't happen, and it so easily can.
As we've sort of seen in Malaysia.
Absolutely.
After happened. Yeah.
Absolutely. There are greedy people who want everything, and they want to control everything, and they're everywhere.
What's the future for you in the Sarawak Report? Are you continuing to investigate and to put pressure on the government?
Well, yes. I mean, tragically, there was a triumph of democracy in Malaysia in 2018, and a recent coup by the establishment, whose profitable exploitation of their country was interrupted by that development, who have seized power again in Malaysia. And democracy and Parliament has hardly sat since. And has received an order from the King of Malaysia to pass the budget and not oppose it on the very rare occasion it has been allowed to sit. It's depressing, and what can you do as a journalist but continue to perform your role, which is circumscribed. I mean, we all team together. The role of the journalist is to report what's happening and to throw light on what's happening and to explain a little bit around what's happening if that is necessary. Not everybody has the chance to maybe open up the country's constitution and examine it for several hours and then point out, and then realize that what X or Y has done counters the constitution. It's the role of the journalist to say, look, X has just broken the constitution. What are you going to do about that, members of the public, authorities, and all the rest? So it's it's a job that will always need to be done, and I guess I'm just carrying on doing it. I'm in the slightly peculiar situation of having done this as a voluntary project, which has liberated me in many respects. I don't have a boss or a lawyer to slap down my views or to stop me publishing the truth, which is, any journalist in the mainstream media will, knows that it's very hard to get out challenging stories for those reasons. So that's liberated me, but it hasn't paid my bills. So it's a tricky one.
Speaking of which, I'd like to highlight at this point that you have written a book about this experience.
Yes, you can buy the book. There are two books. There's one called The Sarawak Report, which is named after my blog, which tells the story of just exactly how I had this extraordinary experience of unraveling the biggest financial scandal recorded. And then there's an easy, racier version called The Wolf Catcher. Lighter reading, which pretty much tells you the same story. But if you feel you could do a pass on the financial detail, that's the one for you.
Okay. Now, is there not an interesting story behind the book publishing as well, in which everything was ready to go when you had a publisher, and then for whatever reason that didn't play out?
Yes, well, it's like so much else. I ended up having to write my own blog in order to cover the stories that I thought were important, that mainstream media, weren't interested in covering, i.e. deforestation on the other side of the planet. And having written this book about the 1MDB scandal, the moment it went up on Amazon that it was going to come out, my publisher received a series of threatening legal letters financed by Joe Low out of the money he'd stolen from 1MDB, in which he threatened my publisher and also indeed sent a letter to every single bookshop in Britain, threatening them if they were to sell the book.
Oh my God.
On the basis, not that, I libeled Jolo, because of course they hadn't read the book, but because they thought I might libel him. And that, and even if it turned out not to be libelous, it would prejudice the trial that he would undoubtedly undergo in the United States were he ever to be captured as a wanted man, as a global financial fugitive. So you have a London law firm who is willing to take money from somebody who acknowledges that he's a global financial fugitive, wanted by the DOJ and the FBI and numerous other jurisdictions around the world. They're prepared to take that stolen money in order to shut up me, my publisher, my book, and threaten bookshops in the United Kingdom.
God.
And there was another more heavyweight book being published at the same time about 1MDB by some other journalists who had a very big publisher, United States publisher. And both my publisher and that major outfit in the United States felt threatened and intimidated by those legal threats and pulled out of publishing the book. So I had to start up a publishing firm and publish my own book, which I did, in order to get this information out to the public. So that gives you a sense of just, what a state of affairs we've arrived at, frankly. That it needed me to say, damn you, I've been sued enough by you lot, and I'm not going to bow to this, and I'm going to take the risk, I guess. They didn't sue me, of course. I've had a...
It's just you barely sweat now.
Well, I've had one or two have been taken to, as far as a writ, but so far, none of the various lawsuits that have been threatened, launched, and indeed are continuing to go through the system have been won against me.
Thank you for your tenacity, Claire.
It helps to have truth on your side, even if power and money is not on your side, truth is a powerful weapon.
Absolutely. And so powerful. A blog and a radio show can topple a government, expose a network of elites across the world, and highlight, as you say, the very flimsy hold that we have left on democracy in a globalized world.
Yes, so please come and join me, folks, aspiring journalists around the world. It's worth doing. May not make you rich, but you're needed.
Actually, I would like to ask that question. Would you suggest to aspiring journalists around the world, if you have a story, even if you can't find somebody to write it for, write it yourself and put it up there and just try and spread the word yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Of course. And I think there's a growing network of journalists who are doing just that. And again, the internet has been a powerful instrument. It has been horrendously abused by, ruthless operators who've flogged their services to misinform. But it's a battle, and generally if the information is out there, I have like a jury, I have confidence that information versus misinformation, in the end, the truth should win the day.
The truth will out. Clare Rewcastle Brown, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel.
Been astounding.
Thank you for lending your ear. All the best.
To finish up, I do ask if there's anyone that you would like to platform.
Well, you might do very well to talk to, if he'll be able to spend you the time, Xavier Justo, who played a separate role but absolutely, symbiotic role in exposing this scandal. He was one of the key whistleblowers who decided to bring out the inside information. And anyone who's been in the business of journalism for any period of time will know that the journalist is only as good as their source. It's not about data and all the rest. It's about getting the inside information out. And Xavier was the ultimate insider. And, eventually Xavier, the insider, and me, the inquisitive journalist, found each other. And that was that was the genesis of the exposure of 1MDB. So his side of the story is a different one. And you might be interested to hear what it takes to be a whistleblower. He spent 18 months in a Thai jail for his pains. So, yeah, it's an interesting story.
Okay, thank you. I will look him up. Thank you so much.